I'm delighted to have two folks joining us today. The next section is on reshaping dominant cultural norms in medicine. Delighted to have Dr. Bonnie Mason, who's the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at ACGME, as well as the founder and former Executive Director of Nth Dimension. She is an orthopedic surgeon, and I have to say has been an incredible partner to me as we've been building out these programs for our organizations. And secondly, Dr. Sunny Nakae, who is a Senior Associate Dean of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Partnership, and Associate Professor of Med Ed at the California University of Science and Medicine. And really excited to hear this workshop from them today. So Drs. Mason and Nakae, I turn it over to you.
Helen, thank you so much, Dr. Burston and the rest of your team for inviting us to give this workshop that we're really passionate about, and I think will underscore so many of the recommendations from both Dr. Lipson and Dr. Yancey earlier in this symposium. You know, today we want to take a practical approach. There have been so many questions, and it really highlights the questions that we receive on an ongoing basis about how do we do this work? What do we do to effectuate change? And how can I as an individual move forward in defining, reshaping, and mitigating some of the challenges? Because we got some questions about what do we do when we receive pushback. So this is one of these practical workshops. I am an action forward, as is Dr. Nakae, an action forward equity advocate, and we hope today's session will give you some action steps for use in your pursuit of equity infusion in your organizations. So I think, Dr. Nakae, did you want to say hello and give us your disclosures?
Sure. So I'm really pleased to be joining everyone today. As Dr. Mason said, really passionate about the action part. The so what part is always the important piece of this learning. And I think it doesn't move us forward enough if we learn about the problems without bringing actionable strategies. So hopefully this workshop will be just that. So we'll give our disclosures. We were so moved by the disclosures of Dr. Yancey and Dr. Lipson that we said we should really do that, because this work is relational work. And why it matters is foundational to why we're all here. And so for this to be transformational, we wanted to share a little bit about our backgrounds and how we come to that. Then Dr. Mason will share a little bit about Equity Matters, and then we will begin the workshop. So my disclosures: I am a first-generation college student and professional. I am the only person in my family to gone to college and earned an advanced degree, and I'm the only person with a career, which means no one in my family knows what I do. So, you know, my sister sets up displays, my brother sells cars, you know, and I do this thing at a university somewhere. I'm multiracial. My father is Japanese and my mother is Western European, like Polish and Portuguese. And I've walked in this world as a racially ambiguous person. If I had a nickel for every time I was asked, what are you? I would be wealthy. So that has impacted how I see race and how I walk in this world and how I belong or don't belong throughout my entire upbringing and professional life. I identify as a heterosexual cisgender woman. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I have had journeys in my life as a single parent, and I am a parent of 3. So I think I've had challenges in trying to complete grad school and working and parenting. And so some of those economic and structural challenges have been part of my journey as a scholar. I'm a descendant of US citizens, Japanese citizens who were incarcerated in the concentration camps in the United States during World War II. And I have firsthand memoirs from my great-grandmother, my aunt, my grandfather, about their experiences. And this level of injustice is close to me and has impacted the way that I see the work that I should be doing. And in fact, it was co-conspirators and allies who are the reason why I am here, right? The reason why I was able to be born. Physicians who treated my great-grandmother, if she had passed away, or if we would have lost our property, like 75% of the Japanese families in the coastal areas at the time of the war. So I am a descendant of immigrants, farm laborers. entrepreneurs, musicians, and salespeople. Those are the jobs that many of my forebears have had. And I am a higher education practitioner. My PhD is in higher ed. And I've been privileged to share the journeys of pre-medical students and post-bac students, non-traditional students, undocumented students, and following these individuals as they become trainees in graduate medical education, and then as colleagues. And so I really consider the expertise, if I have any, to have come from what people have been willing to share with me. And I'm really a part of all that I have met in the diversity work that I've done so far in my career. And it has been transformative, and I'm deeply grateful for it. So.
Well, thank you, Sunny. So my disclosures include I grew up in the post-civil rights era in Atlanta, at which time that town was still very segregated, but I was fortunate enough to be a child of parents who and of two families that value education highly. I'm a third generation graduate of Howard University, and all of my professional degrees are from HBCUs. And I submit that because when we talk, review applicants for our residency programs, faculty leadership, and association leadership programs, many times HBCUs are not reviewed or viewed as top tier schools. That means we're leaving excellence on the table when we don't recruit from HBCUs. I'm a second generation physician also, but as Sunny said, I am a product of those who've poured into me, and pioneering is not lost on me or the people that I've had the benefit and honor of being mentored by, including my mom, who's the first Black female construction engineer for the Rapid Transit Authority in Atlanta back in the post-civil rights era in Atlanta, Deep South. My dad was the first chief radiation safety officer at CDC, and he was a Black man. Dr. Claudia Thomas was the first Black female orthopedic surgeon to become board certified as late as 1980. She's a mentor of mine, and two of my mentors as well, also in orthopedic surgery. One was my chair of orthopedics, who became the first president of the ABOS, who was Black, Dr. Richard Grant, along with the first Black president of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgery, Dr. Edward Anthony Rankin. I finished orthopedic residency back in 2001, and at that time, I was in the first 35 Black women in orthopedic residency to become board certified at the time. So orthopedics remains the least diverse specialty when it comes to race and ethnicity in our entire field of medical specialties. So we still have work to do. But with that being said, I'm now Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the ACGME. And we are moving forward a couple of and Sonny, I'll take the next slide. We're moving forward a couple of really important thought processes and initiatives where we want to emphasize, as Dr. Yancey said, that equity is pivotal and critical for integration at the GME level, but for everyone here as well. And we just want to reemphasize the definition of equity, because it is significant at all levels that we as leaders provide the assurance of conditions for an optimal educational, work, leadership, professional environment for everyone under our purview, learners, faculty, staff, as well as our colleagues. That means that we value all populations, voices, and persons equitably, that we recognize, and as Dr. Kamara Jones would say, rectify historical injustices that we've heard about today as well. And then we provide resources according to need, without judgment. And the provision of those resources will allow everyone within our environment to thrive in doing the work that we are here to do. And this was adapted from, once again, Dr. Kamara Jones, who both Dr. Lipson referred to earlier today, as well as the definition of equity shared by Dr. Yancey as well. In our office, led by Dr. William McDade, whom you'll meet shortly, we want to achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion at GME by certainly diversifying the physician workforce, but we must have learning environments, once again, that are safe, inclusive, and equitable in order to support the diversity that we're inviting in. Diversity is not enough. We must combine it with equity such that we create this environment of inclusion that thereby works to dismantle the disparities and inequities that we're seeing today. Oh, and there we are. So our key domains in the work include diversity, equity, and inclusion with the newest edition of Antiracism, and we must name it. We must say it. If we don't name it nor say it, we can't mitigate it. This is language that we want to become more commonplace in our conversations. We know that our younger generations are far more adept and willing to share this vernacular. And I would suggest that this is one thing we can do immediately today is start saying the words race, racism, defining equity, and differentiating that from equality, such that we all have a common language and common set of definitions moving forward. Sunny. And to do so, we have to start thinking about things a little bit differently. We want to use this reverse ideation approach where we're no longer focusing on the diverse learner, the person who's the first, the only, or different, what they may be bringing to the table or not, what we may deem as their superlatives or deficiencies. We need to focus the lens on ourselves as leaders to create the environment necessary for all people to flourish, but especially those who are from diverse backgrounds. We have to offload that responsibility and that spotlight being on that person. And I liken it to when we were all in microbiology and we were pipetting the microorganism into the Petri dish. We know that the composition of the agar was responsible for the proliferation or death of the microorganism. We are, as leaders, responsible for the composition of the agar in the Petri dish. That microorganism doesn't have a chance if that agar, if that environment is too acidic, too basic, suboptimal for proliferation. That's our responsibility. I get excited about this work, so this is really good. Thanks, Sunny. And so Equity Matters is our new continuous learning and process improvement initiative that we see as a progression of ideas that starts with meaningful leadership investment. That's you with the 5 red stars. Everybody on this call, you get a red star because it has to start with us, where we want to increase diversity in the healthcare workforce. At ACGME, we're focused at the GME level, but this is for all of us, so that we can be active and intentional with creating safe, equitable, and inclusive learning environments so that we can ultimately eliminate the health disparities and inequities that we see. So Equity Matters in and of itself. We're really happy to be partnering with CMSS on this initiative. Will provide a series of unique resources and a vehicle for the GME community, but also for our specialty societies, for our institutions, programs, and faculty to use in order to get this work done and achieve these goals. And then finally here with our specialty associations, this is where you come in because the work is not unidimensional. It is across the entire spectrum of key stakeholders in medical education that we're going to do this work, and whom moving forward are professionally responsible and accountable for making sure we get this work done. And with that being said, I'll turn it back over to Sunny, and we want everyone to take out your cell phones, maybe take a stretch really quickly, because we're going to ask you to be actively engaged in this process. We have an audience response system that we want to share with you today, so you'll be texting, but we're going to achieve these learning objectives for this in this module today, and we'll start rolling right through. We have a lot that we want to share, so if we're going a little bit fast, that's because we want to share these concepts with you, but we also want your feedback via the audience response system, and Sunny will give us some instructions. Thank you.
All right, so for this module on reshaping dominant cultural norms, we're going to explore these cultural norms and how they affect our thinking, processes, and teaching. We want to be able to identify what it looks like when these show up and talk about their impact and examine their impact. So we'll be asking you to give us examples of how these things may show up at your institution. Applying strategies to mitigate these cultural norms and reshape them into inclusive cultures, and then talk about establishing skills and practicing the skills for how to do that. And then hopefully the long-term goal would really be to achieve more equitable outcomes and inclusive environments at our respective institutions. So culture is both the blueprints and the builders. And if we think about, if you're sitting in a building, you can look at the wall right now and you see just maybe what's on the wall and the decorations, but you don't see the conduit on the inside. You don't see the ductwork. You don't see the steel trusses or the things that are actually holding everything up. But there's intention behind this. And so this workshop is really to sort of look at the bones of what is creating the structural norms and practices in our work and learning environments. So this, we just sort of take it for granted, right? This is sort of how we do things. It's shaped by the past. We heard a lot about the history of medicine and how the culture, the structures around redlining have actually shaped even practices in medicine and how we talk about health inequalities. So culture is really the values in action. So in order to change it, we have to act upon it. And the other thing that Bonnie and I like to say about culture is that it's shaped by event and not intent. So we have someone who acts contrary to our values. Our culture is shaped by how we respond in the wake of that. So these are culture shaping moments. When I advise my dean and the senior leadership team, I say, what we do right now is going to shape our culture. It's going to communicate to our faculty what's okay and what's not. It's going to tell our students, yes, this matters, or no, it does not, right? So often we think that culture is shaped by the awards we give and the parties we have and the things we celebrate and the words we put on our website, but that's not true. It's shaped by our events and how we manage what's happening day to day and not by what our intentions are. So this will get you warmed up here. So go to slido.com. You can scan this with your phone and it will automatically take you to the poll and join you to the poll. The code is CMSS. So if you're going to slido.com, you enter in this code. This is all anonymous. We don't collect any of the information. We don't store it. It's not linked to your phone number. It's all just completely anonymous so that we can have a way of interacting since we're not all in a classroom or, you know, in a large conference hall at a hotel or something to be able to hear from you. So when you hear dominant culture, what comes to mind? So your responses will show up in a word cloud here. This is just to sort of get us warmed up. So what do you think about when dominant culture comes to mind? So we're getting some responses, people joining. Okay, white male, privilege, usual suspects, strongest, tolerance, medicine, white male centric. Okay, American, Caucasians, oppression, wealth, culture of the majority. Okay, majority, white people, attitudes, boomer. Okay, strongest. Elitist maybe, leadership, white males in charge, bully, tall, prevalent accepted culture that predominates in a society, lived values. Okay, so these are all really good. So you see that a lot of these things are shaped around whiteness, and a couple, probably about a third of these are actually from a website that was sent to me a year ago called White Supremacy at Work. And it sort of like clicked a light bulb on of these are sort of norms that we accept kind of by default because of, again, the structure of what's dominant within our organizations. So thank you for these responses. So our format is going to be, we're going to give you case scenarios. We've listed more than one to give you sometimes to give you a clinical application and or a sort of administrative application, but we won't go through every one of them. So feel free to read those, or maybe on the recording, you could go back. Then we'll talk about the dominant culture element. We'll define it. We'll talk about reshaping it. We'll talk about mitigating it. And then we'll give you a chance to respond via Slido about how this might show up, or if you see this in your institution. And you'll be able to see everybody's responses to these on the screen as you did just with the word cloud. So here we go. Dr. Mason's gonna kick us off.
Okay, so like we love hands-on case-based work. So the leadership board in your organization has 7 voting members, all of whom are white or Asian, one of whom identifies as female. The chair receives a complaint from a constituent that the diversity of the board is insufficient. So the chair makes a decision to appoint an additional board member who's female from an underrepresented minority group to the board, but as an ex officio non-voting member in order to solve the issue. So what are we defining here? So we are defining a practice called tokenism. This is a cultural norm where we are focusing on the composition of the table rather than an equity practice for the entire committee. So the immediate solve was to find one additional person so that they could have their face at the table, but their voice will be excluded by being ex officio and non-voting. So when we are looking at these DEI endeavors, and we are not considering the expertise or the full breadth of professional capabilities for this person, we are falsely solving the problem in a performative way that by just putting a body in the room that we have solved the problem. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we, yes, are including diverse members from our community, but we want to focus on equity in practices, policies, and personnel procedures such that we're not just making performative moves. We're moving into a transformative space such that equity becomes part of the integral DNA of every single one of our departments, boards, committees, practices. Our workforce and our workplace is being reshaped through an equity-informed lens, through very actionable ways, because this is the way that we're going to build the culture of equity moving forward. So specifically, ways to mitigate this is when we see that we are embarking on tokenism, we need to name it. So many of the mitigating factors that we are going to share with you today requires us to use our voice, such that we will name these types of cultural norms, which we know work against equity when they show up. We want to make sure we step back and clearly define the problem. In this case, was an issue of representation, but across how many subdomains of diversity. This could have been addressed a little bit differently. And then we want to provide training, education, training, and capacity building for that equity practice, and not just focus merely on representation. Diversity in and of itself has not gotten us to the solutions and outcomes that we want to see, either in diversifying the physician workforce, nor ultimately in eliminating disparities and inequities in patient care. So we're going to have to use our voice. We will feel vulnerable when we use our voice. It will be uncomfortable, but that is also how we know that we are moving in the right direction. Sunny.
So a couple of additional thoughts on tokenism while we give you this Slido to, how does it show up at your institution? What I'd like to say about this is a cancer survivor is not an oncologist. And so we assume that because someone has a lived experience with oppression, or that they navigate specific intersections or identities within our institutions, that they automatically have expertise, that they automatically should be the ones responsible, and rather than taking ownership for those things ourselves. And tokenism, it's a good visual, because this is transactional, and remember, we want it to be transformational, which means it has to be rooted in relationship. So what is the purpose of this committee if they're not in the habit of considering equity in the decisions they make? Changing who's in the room is not going to change the practice of the committee, right? So folks of various like and kind don't magically imbue the committee with the skills to consider equity, right? So here's some examples. We have committee membership, process for getting members, expecting oppressed people to solve the problem. Yeah, we just sort of appoint people. This can show up with certain people being asked to serve on every committee because we need a person from that identity domain or intersection to make ourselves feel that we're engaging in equity practice, when really everyone on the committee should be going through training, and we should be thinking about what our equity practice norms are. Assuming that the people of color want to lead DEI work, absolutely. People might say, no, I'm just a radiologist. Like, I was here to talk about that. Like, I wasn't here to represent all things related to health inequalities. Act as if work done if appointed, limited diversity at senior staff, minority tax. We're gonna talk about a lot more of these. This is great.
Yes.
Maybe not making women feel welcome, sure. Not having search committees, but having appointments. Yeah, so not even doing a process. We'll talk about that as well. The status quo, repetitive asks, diverse panels at meetings, Sure, so when we put together a panel, we have to have a certain number. So again, we're making this very transactional about people rather than thinking about who has the expertise or the perspective. And I think the optics matter to a certain extent, but the substance should matter over the optics. And actually that's one of the dominant cultural norms we're not going to talk about today, but that definitely is part of it. Thank you for these responses. And Bonnie, I realize I went out of order. So if you want to take the next one, then we'll be back on track.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, one more. So here's another case. So our leadership team has the opportunity to participate in a multi-institutional leadership collaborative. Oh, and we wanted to say that these are all real cases. So these aren't cases that we made up. These are all based on actual cases. Your leadership team has the opportunity to participate in this multi-institutional innovation that will engage at least 2 to 3 members from your executive team. But without a group discussion, you choose the most senior members to participate, thinking that, well, you know, the junior members have a family and maybe they won't be able to participate because they don't have as much time. So let's just think about who we are excluding, who's being marginalized just based on that one decision, which is an assumption. So this is an example of paternalism. So this is a dominant cultural norm where the authority in their well-intended, you know, effect to or attempt to protect individuals that they judge as, you know, marginal or still in development or maybe, you know, inferior in some way, unconsciously perhaps, you know, they want to protect that person through projection and assumption of a negative outcome, thereby holding back an opportunity for that person. So this is also known as the plantation mindset. And you'll hear comments like, well, if we select a female or Black or Asian or LGBTQ leader, and that person doesn't do well, what happens if that happens? Well, Dr. Lipson talked about, you know, being bold in the face of a daunting task, even if you make a mistake. This is what we can still do, but making the selection does not, of a person who's from a diverse background, that's not the mistake. Not providing that person with the opportunity nor the environment in which that person can be successful, that's where the mistakes are made. What if this staffer shows potential, but if that person fails, it'll set us all back. And this patient will never follow through, so that's taking the assumption or the paternalistic approach all the way over to patient care. So one of the things that we have to do is, once again, reshape our mindset and treat our colleagues and patients as individuals, not as ambassadors or representatives of their entire demographic. We want to go back to our equity mission and say, now, what goals do we want to achieve versus what do we want to prevent? Okay, so this is a fear-based approach that says, well, we're not going to do this or that because this might happen. No, let's reverse this thinking once again and think about this from a positive goal-setting activity where we may have to be vulnerable. We may have to share with our constituents that we made this attempt, it didn't work, but this is how we are revising our actions. And then once again, we have to name paternalism when it comes up, and we want to make sure that we curb discussions, meaning place assumptions and presumptions in conversation, forward feed, you know, poor evaluations or an opinion that may not be based on actual objectivity, that might foreclose opportunities for colleagues and trainees, and check ourselves when we have these thoughts. We want to keep discussions and assessments focused on milestones, admission and clinical care guidelines. So these are the competencies, okay, versus how they identify as a means for not failing. And then we also want to make sure that we're always checking our own biases in what we're sharing in these meetings and closed doors, naming it. So how does paternalism show up at your institution? Please, let's take a couple seconds. You're seeing this in your institutions. We know you are, because the dominant culture has set us up at both in medical education and in organized medicine for paternalism to be a cultural norm. So anybody care to weigh in on how this shows up at your institution?
As Bonnie said, you know, it's often well-meaning. It's often well-intended, right? It's often out of a, you know, motivation to protect or to you know, to stand up for someone, but not present, we have to sort of step back and say, what's my motivation here? Am I not presenting this opportunity? Am I preventing failure or promoting success? There's a difference.
Here they are, relying on senior people, asking the same people, looking at candidates for fit. Now, that's a big one that we want to start excluding from our inclusion criteria, that they'll be a good fit or not. Conference speakers need to be tried and tested, does not leave room for any new people to become tried, right? Or to get the experience. Things have always been done the same way. The opinions and preferences of a few people are accepted as the best options, best practices. People of color, not on the executive team, there's that fit phrase again. It's always been done this way. So these are examples of how paternalism shows up in any number of ways. Potential versus experience, saying that people are too young to lead and too busy. So when we leave out young people from our conversations right now, especially from an innovation and technology-driven direction that medicine and healthcare are going into, even education, we're leaving excellence on the table. We are missing out on this information. This is really great. So we got 32 responses this time. This is good. Physical abilities being prioritized.
I'm sorry.
Yep. No, that's okay.
We have so many to get through.
We do. We got
trigger happy on the clicker. Okay, so we're
Okay.
going to move on to the next one. So sexist remarks. So Jim routinely calls female colleagues sweetie, despite being asked politely not to do that. And after everybody keeps trying to remind him, you know, everybody just sort of gives up and they just accept it and they say, you know, it's just Jim. He really doesn't mean any harm. Or maybe sexist remarks being openly made in front of the team and no one addresses it. So this is an example of fear of open conflict. And we have this a lot in medicine. We work around difficult people we have a lot of agility when it comes to working around difficult people. So we have difficulty with disagreement or debate. Conflict is viewed as something that's negative, so that honest discussion is not really promoted. There are minoritized or marginalized team members that may be more likely to be viewed as causing conflict because they might be bringing up things that other folks don't see or haven't experienced in the same way. And we really impede accountability by not being able to discuss conflict, and bad behavior is really enabled. So the entire team is hurt by this dynamic because we all are sort of taking responsibility for that enabling of bad behavior. So we reshape this by increasing our peer-to-peer accountability and having that be critical for cultural change. One thing that I do with folks that I work with is I ask for feedback a lot. I specifically say, is there anything that I'm doing? Is there any dynamics that you want to ask me about? How often do we go to our colleagues and really ask for that honest feedback about our approaches? We should practice disagreement and debate, invite people to disagree with us. I got feedback early on in my career that I have a strong personality. And so, and I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I recognize that. And so when I'm pitching ideas, I will reserve time to say, now I want to hear from all of you why this is a terrible idea. I'll give an award to the person who comes up with the best justification for why this is like a total bust, right? Because we need to get it all on the table in order to make good decisions. And I can't tell you how many times we've come up with something far better than what we started with that team approach, because people are not afraid to speak up. So if people are being vilified for speaking up or disagreeing, we have to try and disrupt that. We have to create space for those other voices. And again, having an organization or framework that supports conflict resolution and or disagreement in the first place can be helpful. We want to normalize conflict. We need to have bias incident processes in place. So there's ways for us to, again, be structured around handling this, supporting colleagues in attempts to manage these challenges, and really affirming courageous conversations. It's okay to go to a colleague and say, this might be a tough conversation. I really care about our working relationship. Are you willing to have it with me, right? And 9 out of 10 times you're going to get a yes. Because again, this work is relational, right? Relational, so we care a lot, and we also, challenge directly the things that need to be changed. So we want to hear from you. How does fear of open conflict shape the culture at your institution? In what ways does this dominant cultural norm create other downstream effects of how our culture is really shaped?
And to your point, Sunny, we, I think just by virtue of being in medical education, we don't engage in conflict well. So we then avoid conflict, which then tends to amplify the problem. And the conflict, which could have been mitigated earlier through more of that critical conversation and arbitration, now becomes an explosion. So,
Right.
So it looks like people are shunning, it leads to conformity, people, because of fear of losing their job, less engagement. So people will pull back, right? Silence or avoidance.
Yes.
It looks like it prohibits promotions, the status quo is perpetuated, ineffective use, fear of retaliation, bad business decisions. So I hope all of us as leaders recognize that this is going on in the organizations that of people who are on this call, right? So this may be going on under your roof. Retaliation from senior leaders stifles staff voices, the smallish environment. So conflict is hard to move past if it happens. There's less engagement, allows destructive behavior to persist. So this is enabling ongoing bad behavior. And we have to, I think a part of our pursuit of equity and professionalism is being willing to hold our colleagues accountable and understand that that is actually coming from a place of support and teamwork, because we want to get to the root of the conflict, sort it out so that we can continue growing. The avoidance of that conflict will perpetuate some of these issues.
I was fortunate to go to a leadership summit and got to hear Valerie Jarrett speak. And one of the things that she said was, leaders step up to pain and discomfort and recognize that if you're dodging it and avoiding it, it is landing on someone else. So either you take it and you deal with it, or it's going on your team, it's going on your trainees, it's going on your staff, right? It's not neutral. So just because you didn't do the dishes and you left them there, it doesn't mean they got done, right? Like it landed on another person. So leadership and that accountability and incorporating equity into this practice is about stepping up to that discomfort, and in some ways, maybe that pain and the challenge of conflict. All right.
Yes. Okay, so here we have a budget meeting, a junior staff, we have these young millennial physicians that are coming in, and this young staff person or leadership, or even in our organization, wants to attend the budget administration meeting, even though this person just joined the staff at the association. And however, he's told that senior leaders are the only ones that are allowed to attend these budget meetings. And when the junior staffer asks why, the response is, because we've always done it this way. Junior staffers aren't allowed. That's not your role. Stay in your lane. And so one of the things that we've talked about, Sunny and I just think about this hierarchical approach to medicine. And while hierarchy by way of experience and education in the medical education framework and in patient care has just been the hallmark of what we use to drive our decisions, it comes at a cost. And the cost is using it also as a driver of competition. So when we are using competition as a preferred method for talent selection, professional development, group assignment, or process, we are not examining who may be marginalized, what talent we may be leaving on the table, who's not included in this particular endeavor. And so when we use that competition, and we have to take an honest look at the criteria that we're using in that competitive framework, is that based in a historically exclusionary practice that only will allow certain people to be selected, such as AOA, which is now being dismantled in medical education, the medical institutions across the country, because of who was being excluded at the table. Often using competition and referring it to more as kryptonite. When we're using this competitive nature, it does not drive team unity. It also does not drive a sense of support and create that culture of equity and inclusion. And it almost is like a polar opposite of that. And so if we're not recognizing how competition and hierarchy contribute to the outcomes that replicate the same, it just produces more of itself, then we are just going to continue adhering to the same norms and getting the same results. So what we want to do is reshape our thought process and once again, look at who's being excluded by the practices and policies that we have in place. Think about how can we broaden our approach, our catchment area, let's throw out a wider net so that we can bring the diversity of leadership and talent into our realms and assess the goals and outcomes of the current work and ask, is that really getting us where we want it to go? And then we have to be intentional about aligning those goals and practices and then hold ourselves accountable. If we haven't met the goal or the metric, be willing to own that and then adjust moving forward. So in terms of mitigating, we want to make sure that we name it once again. Oh, I think we're using competition here in a way that's exclusionary. And then look at the hierarchy dynamic because we've always done it that way. Really has to be called out as a norm that does not promote the equity and inclusive environments that we want to build. And we want to explore alternatives to competition, such as communities of practice. And if the team wins, then that or does well, meets their goal and metrics, then that's what we consider a double thumbs up versus that individualistic approach. What about the team? What is the team doing? And has the full team been engaged? We want to openly discuss the drawbacks and benefits of doing things the way we've always done them from a competitive or hierarchical perspective. And then we don't want to, and then we want to make sure that this is reflected in our policies and in our practices in a very clear fashion moving forward. This is a leadership decision. This is something that we have to make sure that is a top-down approach to how we're going to do things moving forward. So then here we are. Are there competition and hierarchy norms at my institution or in my association? So here you can just pick one of the multiple choice answers.
I want to make one distinction while everybody is voting.
Yep.
I'll go ahead and click it so we can see the votes. This hierarchy and chain of command are not the same thing. So I know we rely on chain of command organizations and structures for decision making, but this sort of bleeds over into hierarchy in terms of who's allowed to be in the room, who has access, and we start to value individuals in different levels of the organization above others. And so that's really where hierarchy comes into play. And I think, folks sometimes who are in this C-suite forget that someone taught them. Someone allowed them to be in that space. Someone allowed them to stretch into a new role, gave them an opportunity. So we have to remember that we all grew from something, right? And so keeping other folks away from opportunity or using hierarchy and competition to exclude is not going to serve us in developing the talent and inclusivity that we need to tackle these very real problems that medicine is facing.
Right, because it positions people to have to be perfect. So we're going to use this hierarchy or this set of competition because it's worked for us in the past, quote unquote, because if we open the door, the people who come in might not be perfect. Whereas perfectionism is another norm I don't think we'll talk about today, but that's certainly another norm. Okay, Sonny.
And when we say it worked for us in the past, it worked for who? Who's giving that, right? So when people say it's not broken, don't fix it. Who is it not broken for? Because it's been broken for me for quite a long time, right? So that perspective has to shift. Okay, the Executive Search Committee is not happy with the diversity of the slate of candidates, but they feel the search is taking too long and decide to move the slate forward anyway. How many times have we been in the room when something like this happens? We know that our process has not gone according to plan and we just move it forward. So this is one of the norms of sense of urgency or time limits. We allow the clock to really shape so much of our work. Following inclusive practices or consistent protocol, it's difficult. We might truncate discussion on some candidates. We might not manage it properly. There could be thoughtful or shared exchange and it gets hindered because we're just out of time. We have to vote, time's up, let's just do this. And sometimes when we're building teams and looking for talent, time and sort of, well, we have to pick someone, we just have to pick someone. And we end up getting someone that could actually set our mission back because they weren't the right person for that role. So if you know, I'm a fan of Jim Collins and his work studying people and leadership, and the right people on the bus in the right seats is really critical. And so we have to spend the time on our selection processes to make sure that that happens. So we reshape this by considering rotating people around. Maybe we have a timer. We try and structure discussion in a way that we talk about pros, cons, biases across each candidate. Plan to revisit important conversations or tasks if we know that, okay, look, we're only going to have 10 minutes on the agenda to discuss this. It's really important. We're going to put it on the agenda next month instead. Do not sacrifice mission, goals, or people for speed or efficiency, because then you're going to get where you didn't want to be faster.
Yes.
Like, how does that make sense? But we lose sight of it in the moment because we're so wired to be efficient and to generate and to be productive. And we want to check it off the list. And so we say, okay, at least it's done. But we picked the wrong person at the wrong time, the wrong skill set. I mean, then it sets back the work that we actually are hiring that person to do in the first place.
And that's part of how we are acculturated, right, Sunny, even in medicine, where it's always, okay, see this patient, get it done, you have another patient to see, and that expediency really works to undermine the actual work that needs to be done, none of which will be done quickly. And we have to set that expectation that this is a long-term ROI and should be invested in, and the time should be used in planning strategically to achieve those goals. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, absolutely. And in mitigating, many of these mitigation strategies, we're trying to just create names for the things that we know are sort of going on, right? We're trying to sort of label the water that we're all swimming in. So just state that in the meeting, say, I feel like the time limit is hindering our decision-making process here. Can we postpone this? Can we put this into our next agenda? Recognize that we may not need to spend the same amount of time on everyone. Some candidates might be trickier or grittier, particularly in like residency selection or UME admissions. Sometimes the decisions have a lot more considerations that need to be weighed. And again, allowing team members to extend discussions or timelines. So when it comes time to vote, maybe one of the options is, I'd like to extend the discussion, right? I'm not, you know, and even just saying, look, who's ready to vote on this before we move it forward. So we're interested in hearing from you. How do urgency or time limits hinder DEI efforts at your institution? What kinds of ways does this show up that creates additional challenges?
Well, I think that's also to say that it's not that DEI efforts don't require urgent attention, but how we pursue those efforts. Once again, if it's, we've got to do this now, we've got to see an ROI on these DEI efforts now. This work is relational, as Dr. Nakae continues to say. The relationships aren't built expediently, right? And so then we don't get to hear from as many voices. Excellent candidates aren't given a chance. We make the wrong choices, wrong candidates. We miss business opportunities. Then we have turnover, right? So if it's the wrong person, then we have invested in this person. Now we're losing time. We have to spend more money in recruiting and retaining or in finding another person. Then we don't have a good lack of diverse perspectives. We elect the most likely person to say yes versus the most qualified. The efforts backfire because they're not well thought out or sequenced. That's that strategy. These DEI efforts have to be approached, and anti-racism efforts have to be approached strategically. There's the planning that's requirement, and there's too much emphasis on process, not outcome, less diversity due to fear of losing position maybe, or station. And cast a wider recruitment net, put resources behind the effort, absolutely. That moves it from into a transformative space. The reward systems really do not value the related work. We have to do it by X date. It undermines the DEI efforts. There we go, bad and incompetent products or incomplete products. And we have to move someone out of a role. So those are really great responses. Thank you for the feedback on that. All righty, we're I think we're nearing the end. So during an institutional town hall, a faculty member asked the dean, or this could be in your organization, someone asked the CEO, why are education budgets being cut while a new building is being furnished? And the dean responds, I don't have to justify the complex budget to you. Take it up with the CFO. So it's an immediate, sharp retort, shutting that person down. Same thing for, in a Grand Rounds instance. Again, these are all real stories. A resident asks a question of the professor who's lecturing, and the attending responds sharply. That's a senseless question. What year are you in training? You're obviously not qualified to be here. All true stories. So these are examples of defensiveness. So defensive responses are rooted in fear, but it's meant to shut the person who's asking the question down. This hinders a growth mindset within our organization. It diminishes or depletes the opportunity for engagement, and it negatively shapes the culture of our organization. So we want to make sure that if we have this culture of allowing this type of behavior, that we work to reshape it as soon as possible. I think we have to move a little faster. And the way we do that is normalizing point and counterpoint. Invite different opinions, invite other people into the conversation. The part of the hierarchical approach in medical education has not always allowed for or invited questions because it sounds like questioning. But here we want to, and we've raised millennials to ask us questions. So we need to move through the discomfort of receiving those questions in a way that does not tap on our own insecurities. And so we want to provide many mechanisms for leadership to get this feedback, and then share power by taking turns leading the session and putting that maybe even that person in that leadership role. And so in order to mitigate it, once again, we have to name it, establish a team process that welcomes discussion, engages everyone. This is that spirit of inclusivity that we want to inculcate our cultures with in our environments. We want to assign committee members to present different views in advance, and then also to normalize tools that will help us regularize questions, invite questions, and make sure that we are asking everyone to work on their defensive response. Sunny, you want to just pop through to the last one?
Sure, let's skip the poll because we're going to run out of time.
Yep.
So this one is about just a case around parental leave. So Eric is entitled to 12 weeks of parental leave, the company policy, and he takes 6 weeks and then realizes, you know what, after coming back, his partner needs more support. He wasn't ready to transition. So goes back and says, can I take the rest of my leave? And the HR director says no, because the policy says your leave has to be continuous. So now you have to use your vacation, right? So this is an example of rigidity, and we do this a lot. So we don't change or adapt or meet people where they are. We have a reasonable tethering to the letter of the law rather than the intent. The intent of the paternal leave policy or the parenting leave policy is to support our employees, right, in making that transition and to retain talent. Why would we throw the book at this employee and say, you're not going to do that? They're probably not going to come back, right? We fail to revisit, we fail to respond when something's unexpected, and we use the rules to punish some while bending the rules for others. So it's the difference between they should know better and they didn't know better, right? That gray area shows up all the time in how we apply these policies. So we need to adapt willingly, consider intent and technical aspects of the policies, ask ourselves, who's being hurt by rigidity here? And would we be more accommodating for someone else? If Eric were female identified, would we be more sympathetic? Would we be more accommodating? If Eric were a C-suite member versus a staff member, right? So we have to think about how we're applying the rules. And then we can anticipate new and uncomfortable situations and plan for them. So we want to name rigidity when it shows up. I feel like we're being rigid here. This seems like rigidity might be hurting our overall goals. Establish guiding principles for decisions rather than rules, right? Always have sort of a policy or a value or principle statement behind what the rules are. So we can go back to that as our true north, not the rule itself. And then create a response plan for new situations, right? If we have a new situation that's never happened before and we want to make a policy exception, we have a policy exceptions committee. It'll go before that committee. That committee can change policy if we find that there are gaps and things that we need to change. So again, we had another response one about how rigidity shows up. We're going to skip that because we're running out of time, but you guys have been so great at participating. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Okay, one of our last ones. So we want to start a diversity committee to tackle bias and discrimination, racism. The department leadership doesn't really agree though. They see this as making trouble, creating conflict within the department, but they yield. A diversity committee is started and you present the leadership with next steps, and the leadership is like, I mean, really? You've got a committee. What more do you want? That should be enough. And why are you still complaining? You should just be grateful for the fact that, you know, we gave you what you wanted, as opposed to expecting real, meaningful, and transformational change that will result in sustainable evolution of the culture. So when we have this expectation of gratitude from that person who is moving forward, we want to make sure that those in authority, you know, who are the gatekeepers, are checking themselves, or am I expecting gratitude for what I gave you versus this is good for the overall benefit of the organization. When we're looking at this, we have to think about who's, once again, historically excluded, minoritized, or marginalized, who should just be happy to be in the room. Okay, because at least you're here now and you weren't here before, but we've already talked about how that's a performative level of engagement, which is no longer acceptable. And that we sometimes, you know, think about extra work or no compensation, unfair compensation, or poor conditions, and still with no acknowledgement and have that expectation of gratitude there. So if we're going to reshape our thought process, you know, we have to build in the empathy to our decision-making roles, especially as leaders, even if we're not used to doing that. Look at the other person's perspective, even if we're not used to doing that. And more importantly, even if we never had permission to do that as leaders ourselves. No one asked us our opinion, our perspective, or how we were feeling at the time. But the paradigm shift requires that we're going to have to engage people moving forward, in addition to looking at auditing our roles, compensation, and administrative structures for equity, versus this kind of gratis attitude that we've taken over time to say, well, you should at least be happy that you got this, instead of moving the entire agenda forward. And then we want to recognize the talent of the team, and that individuals are not beholden to authority in and of themselves. So once we name it and say that, you know, I think we're being a little bit singular in our attitude of just expecting people to be gracious and grateful, that's not moving us towards our objective, then we need to consider whether the opportunity is equitable and there's a short-term or a long-term gain to what's being offered. And then we don't want to let that expectation of gratitude shape how complaints, concerns, or other issues are brought to the table and thereby viewed.
So I'm going to skip forward to this, but we were interested in hearing whether you witnessed the expectation of gratitude or experienced it at your institution. Here's another example. The CEO wants to implement a new mentoring program within the organization and assigns the only BIPOC member of the team to mentor 3 BIPOC staff members without engaging the team member first, right? They just get an email saying, you're mentoring these people. Other leadership team members are not assigned any mentees, or maybe just have one. So this is entitlement to emotional labor subsidy, and formerly referred to as the minority tax, but we have actually flipped it around and we call it subsidy, majority subsidy, because not taking ownership of the work of mentoring, supporting, coaching, being present for groups perceived as other it's always going on within our institutions, right? If we have historically marginalized, minoritized, and excluded groups, then this is happening within our institutions. We expect them to do this work. It's thankless and usually comes without compensation. We don't value the time, and it takes away from our own development and our own productivity for things that we may want to do. So how do we change this? We have to value this mentoring and coaching and support. If it's happening, we might set an FTE for it. We might pay for it out of a budget. Say, if we have a DEI budget, we're going to give portions of buyouts to individuals who are engaging in this kind of work. Or it should be a larger portion of our rank and promotions file, right? Ask about capacity, interest, commitment, willingness. Believe it or not, all Black people don't like each other and want to mentor each other. All women don't like each other and want to mentor each other, right? There's always this assumption that there's this monolithic kind of typology. Oh, and this person looks like this person, so they'd be great together, when maybe it makes no sense. The person says, actually, I wanted someone who's done XYZ in grant writing. I was interested in a person who could teach me, how to prepare for assistant program directorship, right? So make mentoring pairs that make sense, in addition to not engaging in this entitlement to emotional labor subsidy. We want to name this and be aware of it, recognize it when it's happening within the institution, and really change our policies, change the formula, change the compensation package to sustain that value of emotional labor, and then engage everyone. Emotional labor subsidy is everyone's responsibility, right? You should be mentoring someone. You should be giving your time. These are things that we require of our institution if we're going to thrive in these spaces. All right.
So Sunny, we've gotten the flag, so we have to go ahead and close. But what we were hoping to share was our last two issues were around data, and suffice it to say, the absence of data is also a dominant cultural norm where because if we know, then we have to act. Here's just a quick slide just showing all of the different types of dominant cultural norms that Dr. Nakae and I speak on to different groups, and we customize those because it's something that we get to name, we get to address, but also see the opportunities for reshaping our mindsets and our thought processes, and taking some actual steps towards mitigating the norm, the culture, right? So these are long-term changes that we need to move forward, that it's going to take time, and it's just not something that's going to happen overnight. Every institution was built on a historically racist platform, right? Where people, especially Black and Brown people, have been marginalized. It is going to take time to move those norms towards a sense of equity, but we have to at least name them first. And I just saw the question. The ACGME is working, albeit slowly, but we are working to address some of these norms and keep the ACGME accountable where we work. But our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion has only been in place, 2 years. 2 years. So we are moving this work forward. And right now we have just 2 people doing the work, okay? And that is changing now too. These structural behemoths take time to move and dismantle, but you do want to hold your organizations accountable. Thank you, Sunny. And then I think we'll close here. So thank you so much, Dr. Burston and CMSS. And we hope that this was helpful and applicable in its practical approach to driving an equity-informed culture in your association.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you both so much. That was quite a tour de force. I'm sorry it went so quickly. The comments were just universally like, wow, that was great. Thank you for speaking truth and how well it was executed. So I'm hoping this is a perfect opportunity, I think, for you guys to engage individually with some of our societies as well, and kind of hone the cases down, I think, as well to some of the particulars. So hope you get a chance to kind of take this on the road and do more of this, because it was just such a powerful workshop. So thank you again for this remarkable session.